Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to untangle a really surprising thread that connects 18th century pirates all the way to the creation of the U.S. Navy and even into this much bigger, often forgotten story of global slavery. Okay, so let's just jump right in. What on earth do pirates from the 1700s have to do with the creation of the U.S. Navy? I know, it sounds kind of random, right? But believe it or not, the answer is, well, it's the whole reason we're here. It shines a light on a really critical moment in American history. And as you'll see, it opens the door to a much bigger, much more complicated global story. All right, so to start, let's head over to the Mediterranean Sea. The story really kicks off there, in those pretty turbulent waters, where a huge problem was brewing for the brand new United States. And this threat, it was coming right from the coast of North Africa. You have to picture this. For years, leading right up to the 1800s, if you were an American merchant ship in the Mediterranean, you were a target. These ships were constantly being attacked, the crews captured, and often they were sold into slavery. Meanwhile, these North African states, the Barbary states, were demanding massive payments, basically tribute or protection money, just to let the ships pass safely and to get the captured sailors back. And look, when we say pirates, don't picture Jack Sparrow. These were not your swashbuckling, treasure map kind of pirates. They were known as the Barbary corsairs, and they were, for all intents and purposes, a state-sponsored enterprise. We're talking highly organized privateers who had the full backing of the rulers along the Barbary coast. They were a serious economic and military power, and their whole business model was disrupting trade and hitting ships from Europe and, you guessed it, the brand new United States. And one of the main guys behind all this, sort of the chief antagonist, was Yusuf Karamanli. He was the ruler, the pasha of Tripoli, and he was smart. He looked out at the sea and saw these American ships, which, remember, had just lost the protection of the powerful British Royal Navy after the Revolution. To him, they were just floating dollar signs, a perfect new source of income from ransom and tribute. So you've got these constant attacks, American citizens being enslaved, and these really humiliating demands for money. The young United States was backed into a corner. It came down to a simple but huge decision. Do we keep paying them off, or do we finally fight back? And they chose to fight back. Instead of just opening the treasury again and again, Congress decided they needed a real deterrent. And that led to the Naval Act of 1794. This was a massive deal. It was the law that officially authorized building the very first ships of the U.S. Navy. And the reason, the primary reason, written right into the act? To stop the Barbary pirates. I mean, you can't get a clearer cause and effect than that, right? This pirate threat wasn't just some minor annoyance. It was the thing, the catalyst that directly led to the birth of the U.S. Navy. It was a huge foundational moment for America's role in the world. So the tipping point comes when Thomas Jefferson is president. Tripoli demands even more money, and Jefferson basically says, "Nope, we're done paying." And just like that, this long, simmering conflict explodes into all-out war, the First Barbary War. And that brand new American Navy, well, it was about to face its very first test. Okay, but here's where we need to zoom out, because the story of American sailors being enslaved by pirates, that's not just a standalone event. It's actually just one piece of a much, much bigger global puzzle. A puzzle of slavery that most of us, frankly, haven't heard much about. And that brings up a really important question, doesn't it? Was what the Americans ran into in the Mediterranean some kind of weird, isolated thing? Or was it just one example of a much wider, more common practice happening all over the world? Well, it turns out it was far from unique. For centuries, you had several other major slave trades going on. You had the Arab slave trade, the Slavic slave trade, the Black Sea slave trade, these huge raids in Eastern Europe. We're talking about massive systems that operated across continents and involved millions and millions of people from all kinds of backgrounds. And here's the really crucial point. These systems were not all the same, not by a long shot. We tend to think of slavery through one specific lens, but the reality is they had totally different reasons behind them, different groups of victims, and different things driving them economically. Let's take a quick comparison. You have the transatlantic slave trade, which was fundamentally built on race and was all about providing labor for plantations in the Americas. Then you have the Barbary slave trade. That was driven more by geography and opportunity. The goal wasn't necessarily plantation labor. It was often about capturing Europeans from ships or coastal towns to hold them for ransom or put them to other kinds of work. And you see this pattern everywhere. The Slavic slave trade, that was fueled by constant wars and raids in Eastern Europe. The Black Sea trade, a huge pipeline of enslaved people for the Ottoman Empire. And the Arab slave trade, that one was on another level. It was incredibly diverse and had been going on for centuries before the transatlantic trade even began. Yeah, this quote really gets to the heart of it. The Arab slave trade wasn't just one thing. It was this huge, sprawling network. We're talking over 1,000 years, spanning multiple continents and involving all sorts of ethnicities in all kinds of different situations. And some of these systems had names that are just chilling. Take the harvest of the steppe. That's what they called the raids by the Crimean Tatars. They would literally sweep through Eastern Europe like they were harvesting a field, capturing enormous numbers of people to sell. Human beings treated like a crop. It's just devastating to think about. So when you start to learn about all these different parallel histories, it forces you to look at the past through a much wider lens. And honestly, it's uncomfortable. It really messes with the simple, clean narratives we might be used to. I think the biggest takeaway from all of this is that slavery was never just one thing. It wasn't a monolith. It was this incredibly complex global phenomenon. It took on so many different forms, was driven by all sorts of different motivations, and its victims came from, well, pretty much everywhere. So what does this all mean for us? Well, it means our picture of history is just incomplete if we don't include all of these different brutal systems. It shows us that slavery wasn't always about race. A lot of the time it was about geography, war, and pure economics. And as we saw at the very beginning, it was powerful enough to shape geopolitics and even lead to the creation of something as major as the U.S. Navy. So I'll leave you with this to think about. Once you know this wider, more global story, how does that change how you see history? How does it change the way you understand the forces that have shaped the world we all live in today?